Coming in at number 5, we have Cthulhu's Reign by Darrell Schweitzer. Cthulhu's Reign is an anthology of original horror short stories edited by Darrell Schweitzer. The book collects 15 short stories by various authors with an introduction by the editor. They all share the Cthulhu mythos setting originated by H.P. Lovecraft, with the twist that the dreaded revival of the fearsome Great Old Ones who once ruled the earth have finally come back to take it back, taking the mythos from the realm of contemporary horror into that of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction. Some of the darkest hints in all of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos relate to what will happen after the Old Ones return and take over the earth. In the Dunwich horror, the semi-human half-breed Wilbur Whately speaks in his diary of travelling to non-human cities at the Earth's magnetic poles when the Earth is cleared off, and hints at his own promised transfiguration. Very few mythos stories have ever touched on this. What happens when the stars are right? The sunken city of R'lyeh rises from beneath the waves, and Cthulhu is unleashed upon the world for the last time. What happens when the other Old Ones, long since banished from our universe, break through and descend from the stars? What would the reign of Cthulhu be like on a totally transformed planet where mankind is no longer the master? It won't be simply the end of everything, it will be a time of new horrors and of utter strangeness. It will be a time when humans with a taint of unearthly blood in their ancestry may come into their own. It will be a time foreseen only by authors with the kind of finely honed imaginative visions as those included in Cthulhu's Reign. I don't want to reveal too much or give away any spoilers, but this is definitely one for the reading list. In at number 4, The Croning by Laird Barron. As one of the most prolific contributors to contemporary cosmic horror, Barron has not only written tons of short stories in the subgenre, but some full-length novels as well. The Croning tells the story of Donald Miller and his wife Michelle, who have been married for nearly half a century and travelled all over the world. In Michelle's relentless pursuit of odd anthropological findings, Don has always trailed her happily from what he can remember at least, but now, at the age of almost 80, he's starting to realise that something about Michelle isn't quite right. Now all things must converge. Donald will discover the dark secrets along the edges, unearthing savage truths about his wife Michelle, their adult twins, and all he knows and trusts. For Donald is about to stumble on the secret of the Croning. Strange things exist on the periphery of our existence, haunting us from the darkness looming beyond our firelight. Black magic, weird cults, and worse things loom in the shadows. The children of Old Leech have been with us from time immemorial, and they love us. If you haven't read Laird Barron yet, I would recommend starting with short stories first to get acquainted with his peculiar style, but if you're looking to take that relationship to the next level, The Croning is what you need. In at number 3, we have Dreams from the Witch House, edited by Lynn Jamnick. This anthology brings more fresh perspective to cosmic horror with 19 thrilling short stories, all by female authors. These range from pieces written years ago and now finding a new audience, such as Joyce Carol Oates' Shadow of the Evening, to works by up-and-coming authors like R.A. Kalin, who authored the final story in the collection Memoris. The history of the old world is shrouded in secrecy. Creatures and forces unimaginable inhabited this realm for eons, long before any human navigated the surface of the earth. As the old ones have slumbered or observed from afar, humans have assembled civilization upon this fragile planet. Yet the whispers from the elders have been growing stronger, their energy once again seeping into the world. These whispers are being felt throughout the earth. From the roots of our flora to the dreams of our children, they are preparing us for what is to come. Each story deconstructs or reshapes typical Lovecraftian elements in some way, tending to emphasize individual experiences rather than giving into overwhelming cosmic madness. As Jamnick notes in the introduction, such stories fill not only a narrative gap, also a huge cultural one, that of a female voices in cosmic horror. Some of the most exciting Lovecraftian fiction is currently being written by women, she writes. We're moving away from the elder old guard who in some ways as stifling to diverse perspectives of the unnameable as Lovecraft's own views on the number of topics. One critic wrote, I quote, "I recommend this collection to anyone who enjoys incredible weird fiction. I was not disappointed with any of the stories. The artwork that Sarah created for each story are beautifully rendered." In at number 2 we have The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavelle. Praised as one of the most nuanced Lovecraft retellings in the 21st century, The Ballad of Black Tom begins in 1924 Harlem with the hustler Tommy Tester. Tom has always kept a low profile, even as a street musician, until the day he's recruited by a reclusive millionaire Robert Soydum, who wants Tom's help to manipulate a creature of inconceivable darkness. With the introduction of jaded New York detective Malone, this tale twists into a true nightmare, as Malone recounts findings that signify a completely changed world. Charles Thomas Tester hustles to put food on the table, keep the roof over his father's head, from Harlem to Flushing Meadows to Red Hook. He knows what magic a suit can cast, the invisibility a guitar case can provide, and the curse written on his skin that attracts the eyes of wealthy white folks and their cops. But when he delivers an occult tomb to a reclusive sorceress in the heart of Queens, Tom opens a door to a deeper realm of magic and earns the attention of things best left sleeping. Not only is this novella compulsively readable, it's also another significant contribution to the subgenre. As an African-American man himself, Lavelle has noted that The Ballad of Black Tom is a conscious response to Lovecraft's racism and xenophobia, particularly in his story The Horror at Red Hook, upon which Lavelle's work is based. And indeed, by mirroring these prejudices in his book setting, which again is 1920s New York, Lavelle has created a brilliantly commentative and deeply resonant modern work that any reader can enjoy. The Ballad of Black Tom succeeds in being a compelling story that offers a new perspective and take on Lovecraft. Lavelle could put this spin on all Lovecraft's work and they should be a success. Despite a few serious moments, this is an entertaining read. And finally, in at number 1, we have Agents of Dreamland by Caitlin R. Kiernan. We'll wrap things up with an exceptional piece of cosmic horror by another female author, Caitlin Kiernan. In her novel Agents of Dreamland, a government agent called the Signalman attempts to gather information about an exclusive cult who call themselves the Children of the Next Level. The cult members consume strange fungi to physically elevate themselves, but as the Signalman finds out too late, these are no mere magic mushrooms, but biology warping weapons from another world. With plentiful body horror and a deeply disconcerting narrative style, this book is all of the best parts of Alia Whitley's The Beauty and Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5, neatly paying tribute to classic science fiction in the same breath as Lovecraftian horror. In a ranch house near the shore of the Salton Sea, a cult leader gathers up the weak and susceptible, the children of the next level, and offers them something to believe in and a chance for transcendence. The future is coming and they will help to usher it in. A day after the events at the ranch house which disturbed the single man so deeply that he and his government sought out help from other sources, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory abruptly loses contact with NASA's interplanetary probe New Horizons. Something out beyond the orbit of Pluto has made contact. A woman floating outside of time looks to the future and the past for answers to what can save humanity. In at number 5, we have The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories by H.P. Lovecraft. One of many Lovecraft stories on our list, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories was released back in 1999 and contains the following works of Lovecraft: Dagon, The Statement of Randolph Carter, Facts Concerning the Late Arthur Jermyn and His Family, Cellophase, Nyarlathotep, The Picture in the House, The Outsider, Herbert West Reanimator, The House, The Rats in the Walls, The Festival, He, Cool Air, The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, The Whisper in Darkness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Haunter of the Dark. Yes, that's a lot of a lot. But for now, let's just focus on the title itself, The Call of Cthulhu. The Call of Cthulhu was written back in 1926 and follows narrator Francis Wayland Thurston as he unearths alarming information about the figure of Cthulhu, a titanic monster with tentacles and the wings of a dragon. Along the way, we learn of a cult dedicated to Cthulhu, chant for his inevitable return. As most will know, Cthulhu is one of Lovecraft's most infamous creations, so saying that, the story is definitely worth the read, as are the rest of the shorts included in the collection. What's better than one story? 18, that's right. Coming in at number 4, we have Shadows of Carcosa, Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and more. Shadows of Carcosa is a collection of cosmic horror stories written by some of the greats, including H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, Ambrose Bierce, and Henry James. To quote H.P. Lovecraft, "The true Weird Tales has something more than a secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains. An atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, a hint of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space." Now, one of the many stories included in the book is Lovecraft's Color Out of Space, a short story written back in 1927. In the tale, an unnamed narrator pieces together the story of an area known by the locals as the Blasted Heath in the wild hills west of the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts. The narrator discovers that many years ago a meteorite crashed there, poisoning every living being nearby. Vegetation grows large but foul-tasting, animals are driven mad and deformed into grotesque shapes, and the people go insane or just die one by one. This quickly became one of Lovecraft's most popular stories and remained his personal favourite of his short stories. It has since been adapted into a movie starring the great Nicolas Cage. It did get very good reviews. I have yet to watch it. I know a lot of you have been on me about watching it, but don't worry, I'll get around to it. In at number 3 we have Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. A newer selection on our list, Lovecraft Country is a 2016 dark fantasy novel written by Matt Ruff, who explores the conjunction between the horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, as well as racism in the United States during the era of Jim Crow laws, as experienced by black science fiction fan Atticus Turner and his family. Throughout Lovecraft Country, Atticus must navigate cosmic forces and basic civil rights while embarking on a journey to find his mysteriously missing father, employing the services of his uncle, who wrote a guide to safe travel for black people in the 1950s. On his journey, Atticus and co. encounter many large obstacles. However, it is the ending which is a real doozy, with a Get Out level plot twist. Honestly, this novel is worth a read, cosmic horror fan or not. Not to mention, in 2017, HBO announced that they were prepping an adaptation of the novel with Jordan Peele and J.J. Abrams as executive producers. The show is set to be released this summer at the time of this recording, and I, for one, cannot wait. It's been on my list for months. Coming in at number 2 we have The Fisherman by John Langan. One of the newer books on our list, The Fisherman, was published back in 2016 by contemporary horror author John Langan. The plot concerns Dan and Abe, 2 widowers who have found solace in each other's company and a shared passion for fishing. The pair hear rumours of Dutchman's Creek, a steep-banked, fast-moving creek that offers the promise of fine fishing, and of something more, a possibility too fantastic to be true. However, like most things, Dutchman's Creek is not the work of God, and is instead quite the opposite. Yet the men find themselves drawn into a tale of the place, which will ultimately bring the pair face to face with all that they have lost, and with the price they must pay to regain it. Will the pair be dissuaded by a local who knows of the creek's true history, or will they seek out its magic? The novel is incredibly immersive and will have you biting your nails with each turn of the page. For fans of cosmic horror, this is a modern masterpiece and should be read by all lovers of the genre. The book is almost 2 stories under one title, with it being equally a story about loss and grief as it is a horror story that will keep you engaged and terrified from start to finish. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. At the Mountains of Madness is a science fiction novella written by the creator of cosmic horror, H.P. Lovecraft, back in 1931. The story itself details the events of a disastrous expedition to the Antarctic continent in September 1930, what was ultimately discovered there by a group of explorers led by the narrator Dr. William Dye of Miskatonic University. Over the course of the story, Dye details a series of previously untold events in the hopes of deterring another group of explorers who wish to return to the continent. Throughout the story, we learn of lost cities, incomprehensibly weird creatures, oozing monsters, and of course insanity and pure horror. Now, one of those creatures so beautifully detailed in At the Mountains of Madness is Shoggoth. I quote, "Formless protoplasm able to mock and reflect all forms and organs and processes, viscous agglutinations of bubbling cells, rubbery 15-foot spheroids, infinitely plastic and ductile, slaves of suggestion, builders of cities, more and more sullen, more and more intelligent, more and more amphibious, more and more imitative. Great God, what madness made even those blasphemous old ones willing to use and carve such things?" Absolutely terrifying. At the Mountains of Madness has often been described as the perfect Lovecraftian tale, and one of the greatest cosmic horror books. The story even popularized ancient astronaut theories, as well as Antarctica's place in the ancient astronaut mythology. The story has, of course, been adapted numerous times since its initial publication, with director Guillermo del Toro even attempting to get a movie made based on the story. Fingers crossed.
Coming in at number 5, we've got Vastarian by Thomas Ligotti. A good place to start when trying to find cosmic horror outside of the established granddaddy's work is with Ligotti's tale of a man driven mad by his love for a book. Seems like a lot of Lovecraft fans may find parts of themselves here. Vastarian is a short story from the collection known as Songs of a Dead Dreamer. The anthology is split into 3 parts: dreams for sleepwalkers, insomniacs, and the dead, with Vastarian taking up residence in the 3rd. All the tales in Legati's collection are clearly influenced by cosmic horror, with each part becoming darker. The tale we'll discuss plays in the cliche that every book has an ideal reader by introducing us to Victor Kirion. Victor loves his dreams, so much so that he'd rather be asleep than awake. These aren't lovely flights of fancy though. They are dark, warped visions of a reality that's fallen apart. He refers to it as a beautiful land of shadows. Not everyone's cup of tea, but Mr. Kirion is happy. Soon he comes across a bookshop full of seemingly boring tomes, but a strange dark man brings him to the back and introduces him to a volume detailing the world of Vastarian. This place reminds him so intensely of his dreams that he has to have it. There's no way he can leave without this book, for it speaks to him on a deeper level than he could have ever imagined. Commentary on literary cultists, maybe? The folks so obsessively devoted to their literary gods that they'll defend that relationship jealously or even religiously. Once Kirion takes the book home, his dreams begin to change. It seems like an outside influence has come in and infected his perfect world. Things aren't exactly what they seem, and madness is waiting just around the corner. Coming in at number 4, we've got The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval. Remember the horror at Red Hook? Yeah, most of us would rather forget. They can't all be winners, can they? For all of the lastingly terrifying stories Lovecraft wrote, there were some that he just couldn't make compelling, or largely coherent, or not horribly xenophobic. Thankfully, over 90 years later, Victor Laval retold the story with some new elements to make it both fresh and palatable. The Ballad of Black Tom mirrors a lot of themes and elements originally present in the horror at Red Hook, but this time presents them in a different light. Much more flattering one, too. It tells the tale of Tommy Tester, Brooklyn-based supernatural hustler and musician. By taking on a little side gig involving some Necronomicon-adjacent deliveries, he ends up embroiled in a scheme involving the Great Old Ones. As things get dark, the story switches to the view of Detective Malone, who some will recognize from the source material. Providing an additional viewpoint and revisiting some of what made Red Hook so scary to begin with, this is a smart move to keep things interesting. By taking a look at 20s New York with all of the benefits of being alive in a modern era, Laval is able to pen a smart and topical retelling of this story. It compares cosmic indifference to racist malice and brutality, and even though some see it as a direct rebuttal to Red Hook, The Ballad of Black Tom still manages to get some terrifying cosmic horror in. Somehow, and I know this might seem a little crazy, it finds a way to connect the inhumanity of the universe to the inhumanity of people. Definitely an interesting way to interpret Lovecraft's work. Dropping in at number 3, we've got The Cipher by Kath Koja. Ah, the 90s. Home to some of the best book covers of all time, bar none. Thankfully, it wasn't all just for show. There were some good stories between the covers. In her debut novel, Kath Koja takes a weird hole in the basement of someone's apartment building and makes it an existentially terrifying, disease-ridden read. Originally titled The Fun Hole, I wonder why that was dropped, this book will take a look at a doomed couple. Nicholas and Nakota should not be together by any means. They're both full of venom and hatred, but something keeps them coming back. I guess it's the strange hole in the storage room that they're both unhealthily obsessed with. This is another thing that shouldn't be there. But the fact that it's unexplainable and somewhat explorable through the use of 90s video capture technology makes it impossible to ignore. It pulses and exudes an era of wrongness, and somehow this manages to be magnetic. Could be a commentary on both the characters and their life choices. I'm terrible for being drawn to horrid media? Nah. If the characters and subject matter don't disturb you, the prose will. The Cipher is written to make you upset at every turn. It reeks of disease and cancer. Odd sentence structure, hypnotic pacing, malignant terrors within the fun hole. This is a magnificent piece of otherworldly terror. Plus, Koja somehow managed to write this while taking care of her young child. Maybe that's what inspired the extreme darkness. Cruising in at number 2, we've got Blind Sight by Peter Watts. Fans of hard sci-fi should have their ears perked up right now. Oh, and folks with an interest in nihilism too. Maybe people who like their fiction very, very technical as well. Has this piqued any interests? Perfect. Blind Sight is a first contact story involving artificial intelligence, space vampires, and 9-legged spider things. Very cool. It opens with some choice phrases like, if we're not in pain, we're not alive, and you will die like a dog for no good reason. This gives you a pretty good idea of what direction the book is heading in. By addressing themes like identity and consciousness, Blind Sight makes readers wonder if they're even anything at all. It's cosmic in a more universal sense. It doesn't necessarily anthropomorphize or idolize the uncaring forces of the universe. There are no great ones or outer gods here. Instead, the universe just sorta is. There's a spacecraft known as the Rorschach that seemingly communicates with the humans aboard the Theseus. Not exactly subtle names here, but they work. The Rorschach appears to be deliberately making attempts to correspond with the Theseus, but later on it's made clear that it may not actually know what it's saying. The beings on board, though, have abilities beyond the scope of humanity and operate on a level beyond our comprehension. They don't really care about us, and we couldn't possibly understand them. You see where this is going? While a lot of hard sci-fi can get overly technical and difficult to parse, Watts does a commendable job of making it accessible enough for folks who are entering from other literary spheres. And for every big idea, there is a big scare to go along with it. But just don't expect that everything will wrap up in one tight little package. And finally, at number 1, we've got The Croning by Laird Barron. By introducing the often hard to visualize themes of cosmic horror to a doomed love story, Laird Barron finds storytelling gold in The Croning. It's the tale of a man desperately in love with his wife who is deeply involved with something occult. The children of Old Leech, if you will. The big twist, though, is that our protagonist, Donald Miller, is in the early stages of Alzheimer's. He and his wife have been together for decades, and he's followed her around the world as she sought out strange and supernatural events and objects. The plot bounces back and forth between Don in the 80s, full of life, totally cognizant of the strange events happening around him, and Don now, confused and amnesia-stricken. By dealing with the amnesiac trope in a different way, the audience is presented with some extremely effective dramatic irony. As we move between the time periods, readers become more aware of the danger Don is in and how deeply entrenched his wife is in the cult. However, as he recalls details from his past, he also forgets due to his condition. He wants to believe that he's just imagining things and that the supernatural beings aren't real, and thanks to his lack of permanent memories, they seem to be just a silly story that he's misremembering. But the threat is real, and everyone but Don knows it. Creative in its execution, terrifying in its delivery, The Croning is a shining achievement in modern cosmic horror literature.
Coming in at number 5, Lock and Key. Lock and Key is an American comic book series written by Joe Hill and illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez, and published by IDW Publishing. The plot is presented in non-chronological order. During the American Revolution, a group of rebels, hiding beneath the future Key House, discover a portal to another dimension, the plains of Leng, filled with demons who can mesmerize anyone that sees them and possesses them through touch. However, when demons attempt to enter the real world, they collapse into lumps of whispering iron, which young smith Benjamin Locke forges into a variety of magical keys, including the Omega Key, which seals the entrance to the dimension. The magic of the key house gradually evolves over the years, including a spell which causes occupants to forget about the keys and the magic of the house when they pass their 18th birthday. The narrative of Lock and Key is structured in 3 acts. Each act consists of 2 storylines of 6 monthly issues. Act 1 story arc, Welcome to Lovecraft, was a 6-issue limited series published by IDW Publishing. The series was adapted into a film trilogy which was officially announced at the 2014 Comic-Con. However, in October 2015, Joe Hill confirmed that the films are no longer happening. However, he stated that a TV series is still possible. In May 2016, Joe Hill announced he would write a TV pilot, serve as executive producer, and pitch the show to various networks. And it worked. Coming in at number 4, Fatale. Fatale is a supernatural noir comic book created by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. It was published by Image Comics between January 2012 and July 2014. The series was initially announced as a 12-issue limited series, but it was later extended to 24 issues. Fatale chronicles the life of Josephine, or Jo, an archetypical femme fatale who is seemingly immortal, having survived from the 1930s to the modern day unaged, and also has a supernatural ability to hypnotize men into becoming intensely infatuated with her, whether she wants them to be or not. Through the decades, Jo struggles to understand and control her powers while being pursued by a violent cult. The cult worship cosmic gods reminiscent of Lovecraftian horrors, which are somehow tied to Jo. During her travels, Jo also encounters many men who quickly become entranced by her, often to fanatical degrees. They become entangled in her escapades, possibly as guardians, collaborators, and lovers. A motif of the series is how these men pay dearly for becoming involved with Jo. The narrative jumps back and forth between different time periods and points of view, primarily Jo and the men entranced by her. The first issue of the series sold well, with reviews being mostly positive, with comparisons to the creative team's previous work on Sleeper, Criminal, and Incognito. Coming in at 3, The Courtyard. Alan Moore's The Courtyard is a 2-issue comic book miniseries published back in 2003 by Avatar Press. The comic was adapted adapted by Anthony Johnston with artwork by Jason Burrows from a 1994 prose story by Alan Moore. The plot concerns Aldo Sachs, an FBI agent using anomaly theory, a method that correlates seemingly unrelated data into a cohesive whole, to investigate 3 seemingly unrelated ritual murders around the United States. His investigation leads him to a nightclub in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where he hears of a psychoactive drug called Aclo, peddled by a mysterious veiled man named Johnny Carcosa. Sachs sets up a meet with Carcosa at the dealer's apartment building, where he is given a hallucinogenic white powder as a prelude to the alco. Carcosa speaks an unknown language to Sachs, who experiences visions of spectral planes and hideous primordial creatures, while understanding the truth that Aclo is not a drug, but the language Carcosa spoke to him. The visions given to him by Aclo drive Sachs to murder his neighbor using the same modus operandi as the killers he was investigating. The original 1994 prose story first appeared in an anthology, The Starry Wisdom, a tribute to H.P. Lovecraft. The comic book adaptation was planned to appear in Alan Moore's Yuggoth Cultures and Other Growths, but it was published as a limited series by Avatar in January and February 2003. Coming in at number 2, Neonomicon. Neonomicon is a 4-issue comic book limited series written by Alan Moore again and illustrated by Jason Burrows, published by American company Avatar Press in 2010. The story is a sequel to Moore's The Courtyard and part of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Moore later continued the sequence with his comic Providence. The plot concerns FBI agents Lampert and Brez, who visit Aldo Sachs at a psychiatric hospital where he has been detained since committing 2 murders. They are investigating a copycat killer and want to question Sachs about his motives. Moore talks about the genesis of the project in an interview with Wired magazine. I quote, "It was just at the time when I finally parted company with DC Comics over something dreadful that happened around the Watchmen film. I had a tax bill coming up and I needed some money quickly, so I happened to be talking to William A. Christensen from Avatar Press, and he suggested that he could provide some if I was up for doing a 4-part series. So I did. So although I took it to pay off the tax bill, I'm always going to make sure I try and I make it the best possible story I can." According to reports, Moore wanted to elaborate on some of the ideas presented in The Courtyard while at the same time telling a modern story that did not rely upon a 1930s atmosphere. Another idea was to use some of the elements he felt Lovecraft himself and pastiche writers censored or left out of the stories, such as the racism and sexual phobias. Moore explains, I quote, "Lovecraft was sexually squeamish, would only talk of certain nameless rituals, or he'd use some euphemism, blasphemous rites. It was pretty obvious, given that a lot of his stories detailed the inhuman offspring of these blasphemous rituals, that sex was probably involved somewhere along the line. But that never used to feature in Lovecraft's stories, except as a kind of suggested undercurrent. So I thought, let's put all of the unpleasant racial stuff back in, let's put sex back in, let's come up with some genuinely nameless rituals, let's give them a name." And finally coming in at number 1, Fall of Cthulhu. Fall of Cthulhu is a 2007 American comic book series written by Michael Allen Nelson and published by Boom Studios. The series itself was creatively influenced by the works of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, specifically the Call of Cthulhu, with the main characters of the comic finding themselves swept up in an ancient and elaborate plot designed by the dark god Nyarlathotep to provoke an apocalyptic war between powerful beings known as the Great Old Ones. Following the initial 15-issue series in June 2008, a sequel 4-issue miniseries subtitled God War began publication the following month. Fall of Cthulhu Apocalypse, a second 4-issue miniseries, ran from November 2008 to February 2009. Then, the third and final miniseries, Fall of Cthulhu Nemesis, acted as both a prequel and coda, detailing the origin of Mr. Arkham's pet cat. Hexed, a spin-off 4-issue limited series starring Lucifer, also written by Nelson and illustrated by Emma Riso, was published alongside Apocalypse. An ongoing series that ran for 12 issues, also titled Hex, was launched in August 2008.
I've never fully understood that tradition.
For the ferryman. The ferryman who takes the body across the river into the land of the dead.
For the curious amongst you, that clip was from 2001's From Hell, starring Johnny Depp, and although his faux Cockney accent was pretty close to abysmal, it was still an equally impressive interpretation of one of the greatest horror graphic novels of all time, which may or may not be on this list. I guess you better stick around to find out. Kicking off at number 5, Hellblazer. We can't speak horror comic books without first referencing one of its most captivating and bad characters, the con-man slash demonic mage, John Constantine. In actual fact though, before his own series, Constantine peeked his head through the panels of the legendary horror comic Swamp Thing, which may or may not be on this list, first appearing in the June 1985 issue of the Saga of Swamp Thing. Listen guys, you've all got pretty awesome horror taste, and I'm fairly certain that for those of you that haven't yet read Hellblazer, you'll gobble it up like a bloated demonic hellhound at an all-you-can-eat buffet. And if that simile went over your head, in other words, you'll really enjoy it. Hellblazer is equal parts occult detective noir, gritty fantasy, pure horror, and in several instances, incredibly hilarious deadpan humor. Also, its name is attached to some of the most legendary writers in horror history: Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Peter Milligan, the fantastic Garth Ennis, and that's only to name a few. Originally published by DC Comics but later picked up by Vertigo for its most captivating 15-year run, Hellblazer and John Constantine will literally take you to hell and back, and also literally gives Satan himself the middle finger. If that's not reason enough to enjoy Hellblazer, I'm not sure what is. Swinging in at number 4, Hellboy. I mean, John Constantine aside, there isn't really a more iconic horror demon leading man than Big Red himself, Hellboy. And also, as a side note, Ron Perlman is the only cinematic Hellboy ever, although I think we should all give fair chance to David Harbour because that guy is dope. Created by the legendary Mike Mignola, Hellboy is perhaps one of the most notoriously awesome horror creations in fiction, and much like Hellblazer, carved the path through alternative storytelling by literally littering the way with more evil Nazi occultists, 11th hour rituals, and murderous clockwork killers than you can shake a pitchfork at. You know what was so awesome about Hellboy though? He's the literal definition of an anti-hero. He's the son of the demonic Duke Azael, and despite that, he's also the personification of being a damn good dude. Also, his real name is Anung Unrama, which means and upon his brow is set a crown of flame. How cool is that? The Hellboy series ran from 1993 all the way up to 2016 in one of the most captivatingly original displays of Lovecraftian horror, badass one-liners, and tear-jerking moments of family and brotherhood. Next up at number 3, Sandman. Alright, you might be thinking, come on Jack, Sandman isn't really scary, and while in some ways I tend to agree, but the matter of fact is that Sandman is one of the most uniquely original horror titles in graphic literature, and more than anything, I appreciate originality. Also, it's Neil Gaiman. Come on. Time and time again, Sandman continues to be a genre in and of itself, blending fantasy, magical realism, and psychological horror into a neat, terrifying, and cerebral package. The Sandman series, again published by Vertigo via DC Comics, focuses on the main character of Dream, also known as Morpheus, and many other mythological names. It tiptoes its way across such a broad church that it's oftentimes so easy to get lost in its narrative, and I mean that in a good way, blending eternal concepts of religion, mythology, and folklore through a stream of terrifying consciousness. When the series first began in 1989, Neil Gaiman was just another British upstart trying to make his way in fiction. But when it ended in 1996, everyone just kind of held up their hands in awe and said, okay, alright, who the hell is this dude? Listen, Sandman isn't exactly full frontal horror, but when it pulls the scares, it pulls them like no other. Coming in at number 2, Swamp Thing. We can't really make a horror comic book list without putting Swamp Thing on it. There are laws to these things, you know, and I don't want to break them. With the more modern incarnation of old Swampy, who is all round probably the most decent dude in comic book history, it may be easy to forget that the origins of Swamp Thing literally form the basis for contemporary horror. And we have one man to thank for that, the legendary Englishman and perhaps the greatest graphic novel writer in history, Alan Moore. Before that though, Swamp Thing already had incredible horror pedigree with its creators Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, who creeped onto the canvas in a horrifying display of creature feature body horror, sticking on the fringes of comic book fandom whilst developing a hardy cult following. The thing is though, when Alan Moore took control of Our Boy Swampy back in the 80s, vegetable matter was never the same again, and horror fiction was battered by some of the most horrific scenes ever inked. With each page, Alan Moore took us deeper and deeper into the horrors of the swamp, in grotesque displays of death and resurrection, and the fierce eternal struggle of creation. He gave us the Parliament of Trees and the Green, the Floronic Man, and of course John Constantine himself, all the while penning some of the greatest literary horror moments of the 20th century. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Tales from the Crypt. There is perhaps one literary graphic showstopper that modern horror owes all of its creation to, even shows the likes of The Twilight Zone, Black Mirror, even True Detective, which wouldn't be the fictional works that they are without the horror granddaddy of them all, Tales from the Crypt. Although there are several precursors, one comic book series ruled the roost of horror way back when, in the first half of the 1950s. EC Comics, the otherwise unknown publishers of The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, and of course Tales from the Crypt, the bi-monthly weekly anthology series that delivered some of the most excruciatingly horrifying tales of all time. Although their reign was short, running only between 1950 and 1954 before, the censorship board had a thing or two to say about the nature of their content, the Crypt Keeper, alongside the Vault Keeper and the Old Witch, swiftly became some of the most iconic figures in horror history. Horror hosts the world over wouldn't be the horror hosts that they are without these mysterious, terrifying, hooded figures first carving their way through modern entertainment and popular culture. Tales from the Crypt had one intention, and it delivered that in pits and spades. Scare the living daylight out of us. And it did.